Treasurer Wayne Swan. We're taking you live now to a speech being delivered by the Shadow Treasurer, Joe Hockey.
It is a forum that I've been involved with for more than 18 years, and I welcome every chance to come back. My core economic beliefs have not changed since I first addressed the Sydney Chamber as a privatisation advisor to the New South Wales Coalition Government back in 1993. And in relatively recent speeches in Melbourne, Hong Kong and Washington, I clearly defined the values and economic priorities necessary for our nation's fulfilment of its prosperous economic destiny. Here in my hometown of Sydney, I wish to offer a coalition plan that continues to build on the foundations of our collective economic values. The coalition has done an enormous amount of work over the last 12 months. Over the next few days, the Leader of the Opposition, Tony Abbott, and my colleague, the Shadow Finance Minister, Andrew Robb, will further add to our economic agenda. Capital market volatility is going to be with us for many years to come, and many governments are going to continue to struggle with the burden of larger sovereign debt. For example, since 2007, the ratio of net debt to GDP of leading Western economies has grown from 52% to 82%. So governments will have to make very difficult decisions to wind back expenditure and to increase taxes to get their budgets back in shape, and therefore to start to pay down their sovereign debt. At the same time, many central banks will continue with expansionary monetary policy settings that attempt to provide stimulus to anemic economies and to avoid deflation. Central banks in the major developed economies are currently going to extraordinary lengths to flood liquidity into their local communities. The United States and Japan have official interest rates close to zero. The United Kingdom official interest rate is just 0.5%, and the European repurchase rate is 1%. In addition, both the United States and the United Kingdom have engaged in quantitative easing. That's essentially printing money to help keep long interest rates low. And now the European Central Bank is providing the banking system with long-term liquidity of an almost unlimited scale. Analyst Charlie Aiken has today described the reliance on this flow of central bank liquidity as monetary policy morphine. It's an apt term. If fiscal policy remains contractionary and monetary policy levers are fully utilised, then it's legitimate to ask where the economic growth drivers will come from over the next few years. There is an expectation amongst many policymakers that Asia will be the world's primary driver of growth, certainly over the next 20 years. As I said in Hong Kong recently, the growth of Asia's middle class is Australia's most significant economic opportunity. Within 20 years, there will be a well-established group of some 2.5 billion new middle-class consumers across Asia, seeking a modern first world lifestyle with all the expectations and demands to match. The other clear lesson from ongoing economic volatility and uncertainty is that continued prosperity cannot be taken for granted. Australia relies heavily on foreign capital markets for investment in housing and business, and Australia relies heavily on foreign money to fund the government. Whilst the banks only source around 20% of their funding from offshore, and now increased 80% of the federal government's bond issues are held by non-residents. Any disruption to foreign capital inflows would have a serious impact on Australia's economic growth. And such a disruption could be the result of events offshore, but it could also stem from the loss of investor confidence in the quality of government in Australia. Sovereign risk was never an issue before, but since the election of Labor in 2007, analysts have added it to the Australia equation. This is a key vulnerability that must be addressed. All of this is appropriate background for understanding our economic destiny. Put simply, the major economic mantra across the world over the next few years will be growth, growth, growth. Australia must be no different. A strong economy is the foundation on which prosperity is built. A strong economy provides jobs, well-paid jobs. A strong economy provides the resources to assist those people who are less well off. A strong economy provides the basis for essential public services and infrastructure that provide the fabric of our civilisation and society. And a strong economy promotes social cohesion, opportunity and the hope that we can bequeath a better life to our children than we have enjoyed ourselves. Unlike the current government, the Coalition will not rely on fiscal stimulus to achieve growth. Instead, we will embark on a coordinated economic strategy on 4 fronts. The first step will be the restoration of sound public finances through cutting the waste, reducing the spending and paying down public sector debt. The second element will be to lower taxation to enhance the rewards for effort and to reduce the fiscal drag on the economy. Third will be a souped-up productivity agenda with higher labour force participation, reduced red tape and the facilitation of further restructuring of industry. The fourth step will be to facilitate even stronger engagement with our trading partners with a particular focus on Asia. The first step for a strong economy is to get the federal budget back onto a sound footing. In 4 short years, the federal government's net financial worth has deteriorated by over $200 billion. This breaks one of the government's own fiscal rules, which included a commitment to increase the net financial worth of the Commonwealth over the medium term. The Coalition will continue to relentlessly pursue the Labor Party to deliver its first budget surplus in 23 years. A surplus is essential so that we can start to pay down the massive debt that has been accrued over the last 4 years. A surplus adds to national savings and reduces our collective reliance on money borrowed from overseas. It takes upward pressure off interest rates and it lays down fiscal flexibility so that we can be prepared for the volatility I talked about earlier. If you don't run a surplus with the best terms of trade in 100 years, with unemployment at around 5%, then you will never commit to live within your means. On budget night in May, it will not matter whether the Labor Party promises a surplus for 2012-13. They've done that before. What matters is whether they actually deliver a surplus, and we won't know that until just a few weeks before the scheduled election in September 2013. So it'll all be revealed a year and a half away. Pardon my cynicism, but in the last budget the government promised a $23 billion deficit, and in 6 months it deteriorated to a $37 billion deficit. Of course, if the government does manage to deliver a surplus next year, it will not be based on a significant reduction in government expenditure or the size of government, but rather it will be based on a massive increase in tax. In fact, the government currently projects a $38 billion increase in receipts between this year and next year. That is based in part on ongoing high commodity prices. Adding to the fiscal uncertainty, the government has been bearing a massive increase in expenditure over the next few years in off-budget vehicles like the $50 billion National Broadband Network and the $10 billion Clean Energy Finance Corporation. This is funded by additional borrowed money, which will take the Commonwealth gross debt position to nearly $250 billion. There are further spending pressures in the pipeline. The government has refused to explain where the money is coming from for new commitments like $36 billion for 12 new submarines. The Commonwealth's 30% share of the Gonski Education Plan starts at $5 billion a year, up to $6.5 billion each year for the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and a dental program commitment to the Greens. On top of all this, future governments will have to find $136 billion to repay the principal on Labor's debt, which by 2014 will cost over $7 billion a year in interest alone. So this enormous funding task over the forward estimates and beyond is creating huge vulnerability in the economy. It will, of course, be additional to the structural challenges associated with an ageing population detailed in the intergenerational report. The government's forward projections assume commodity prices and the terms of trade hold at relatively high levels. If there is another disruption to the global economic system, the terms of trade will come off very quickly indeed. The rivers of gold on which the government's revenue estimates are based would evaporate, plunging the budget into deep deficit. This goes to the heart of the irresponsible economic management of the current government. My colleague Andrew Robb will have more to say about these vulnerabilities in the coming weeks. In order to inoculate the Australian economy, the Coalition believes the government must live within its means. The Coalition has prepared us for the challenge before and will do it again. Based on current data, we will achieve a surplus in our first year of office, and we will achieve a surplus in every year of our first term. In addition, in reply to the upcoming budget, the Coalition will announce its own medium-term fiscal rules that ensure that Australia lives within its means. These rules will offer some strategic depth to the budget should the international environment again turn sour. In the meantime, I'd like to touch on two other issues. Under the Coalition, the budget will not be the first lever pulled in the event of another downturn. I would prefer to see greater use of monetary policy for managing demand, with movements in interest rates used to smooth the economic cycle. And I note the comments by the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank earlier today. Interest rates are a particularly powerful tool in Australia due to the preponderance of floating rate mortgage loans and small business loans. It's known as the transmission factor. This allows policy changes to flow through relatively quickly, with the full impact playing out within 12 to 18 months. In contrast, fiscal policy can be unwieldy with long timelines. There's a danger the spending will hit the system too late and end up adding to the business cycle rather than smoothing it. For example, spending on the government's Building the Education Revolution has continued into 2012, some 3 years after the emergency stimulus package was put in place. More generally, there are dangers in Australia going it alone with fiscal stimulus. In the event of another significant global downturn, there is only a very limited capacity for additional budgetary stimulus in much of the rest of the developed world. In a small, open economy like ours, unilateral fiscal stimulus will tend to leak out of the economy through increased imports. The stimulus effect on domestic industries will be blunted, and this suggests that going forward we should be very cautious in using the budget to manage domestic demand. Overall then, I'd prefer to see monetary policy used as the primary tool for managing demand. Fiscal policy should be focused on the supply side of the economy. There should be well-targeted spending on infrastructure to remove roadblocks to a more efficient economy. And we must ensure that the tax and welfare systems have the right incentives to reward risk-taking and hard work. I also want to further explore the use of the structural budget position as the benchmark for fiscal performance, and I spoke about this at the Press Club last year. The structural position adjusts the budget balance for the economic cycle. In the current very favourable circumstances of generational highs in the terms of trade and close to full employment, Australia should ideally be running very large budget surpluses. This is effectively putting money aside for a rainy day. The fact that the budget is still in a very large deficit suggests the structural position is indeed very dire. And as I've said, that leaves us very exposed should commodity prices and the terms of trade unexpectedly decline. Australia lags behind world best practice in its measurement and assessment of fiscal performance. Other countries have taken the lead, like Chile, which has focused on the structural budget position since 2000. The United Kingdom, in the last 2 years, adopted the structural budget balance as a yardstick for fiscal performance. In addition, the IMF and the OECD regularly publish their estimates of structural deficits. One of my first acts as Treasurer will be to direct the Treasury to publish estimates of the structural budget position in every budget and in my EFO papers. The second step in the Coalition plan for a stronger economy is to reduce the overall burden of taxation. Labor has introduced 19 new or increased taxes, including the carbon and mining taxes. The government's solution to every problem is to tax it and increase the cost for Australians, whether it be alcohol, motor vehicles or of late private health insurance. The Coalition will continue to oppose the carbon and mining taxes and will send them in government. Those two taxes alone will raise $35 billion over the next 3 years. The carbon tax is a bad tax. It will severely hamper the competitiveness of our industry on the world stage because no other country is introducing an economy-wide carbon tax. A number of private sector commentators now believe the inflationary impacts of the carbon tax will be higher than what the government has said. And I think we'll hear more about that over the next few weeks. This will continue to hurt manufacturing industry in particular. The carbon tax will